I want to thank you for joining me in another study of the book of Isaiah. I'll ask if you will please be turning to chapter 30. As Lord willing, we will be concluding that chapter today and then moving on in our study, our analysis of what has been referred to as the books of woe. That's chapters basically 28 through 33 in those chapters. Let's back up just a little bit again to keep our flow here. Back in chapter 30, we saw a woe to the rebellious as we began chapter 30. We'll be concluding chapter 30 with this lesson. You see, the folly of trusting in Egypt is verses 1 through 7. And then rebellion and forfeited blessing in verses 8 through 26. And then in our conclusion for today, we'll see Assyria's punishment. That's verses 27 through 33. Then as we continue to move forward in chapter 31, we see a woe to worldly trust. It's going to be a continuation largely of the concept that Judah was attempting to trust in other countries to help them out. We see a glorious future, chapter 32. And then chapter 33 will conclude this section, and that is going to be a woe to the destroyer. And looking at the historical context and understanding this best, it's likely this is referring to an invasion by Sennacherib. And so we see Assyria again receiving the brunt of that woe from Isaiah's pen. So now let's look at Assyria's punishment, verses 27 to 33. Now, as we're setting this stage, let's realize that much of what is going on here is because of Assyria. Because Assyria had risen to a place of prominence as they were the world power at this time. Throughout the book of Isaiah, they have been involved in some aspect of what's been going on, either coming against and attacking God's people, or God's people reacting in certain ways because of a fear of what Assyria could do. And that's what's been going on with this concept of seeking help from Egypt as an alliance. Remember back in chapter 7 again, we've mentioned this numerous times, but it's worth mentioning again here. Ahaz received a sign. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. That's quoted in Matthew chapter 1, and it's applied to Christ. So we see that being indeed a messianic prophecy. But what was going on was that Ahaz was in the line of David, and he was basically being told that God is going to maintain that line. You're going to be okay. You're not going to fall, despite what Israel and Syria wanted to do in replacing him with a puppet king they could control. So all of that was seen through there. And I'm saying all of that to say this here. Assyria was part of the problem all along, largely how God's people were reacting. But Israel is not going to go unnoticed. God sees, God knows what's happening. And Assyria is going to be punished. Historically, we're going to know that it was Babylon that did that. So let's finish reading this chapter, chapter 30 of Isaiah, verses 27 through 33. Behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar, burning with his anger, and his burden is heavy. His lips are full of indignation, and his tongue like a devouring fire. His breath is like an overflowing stream, which reaches up to the neck to sift the nations with the sieve of futility. And there shall be a bridle in the jaws of the people, causing them to err. You shall have a song as in the night when a holy festival is kept, and gladness of heart as when one goes with a flute to come into the mountain of the Lord, to the mighty one of Israel. The Lord will cause his glorious voice to be heard, and show the descent of his arm with the indignation of his anger and the flame of a devouring fire, with scattering, tempest, and hailstones. For through the voice of the Lord, Assyria will be beaten down, as he strikes with the rod. And in every place where the staff of punishment passes, which the Lord lays on him, It will be with tambourines and harps, and in battles of brandishing he will fight with it. For Tophet was established of old. Yes, for the king it is prepared. He has made it deep and large. Its pyre is fire with much wood. The breath of the Lord, like a stream of brimstone, kindles it. Powerful, strong language used. The language that is used here often is used in regard to punishment, conviction of wrong. Assyria is going to go down. They seemed all but impregnable to Judah at this time. Judah tried to do everything they could do to avoid what would happen with Assyria. And God says, I've got Assyria in my time. It's going to occur. In verses 27 and 28, the phrase, the name of the Lord, stands for all that he is. His being speaks of revelation and action. And here he comes forth like a mighty warrior to defeat the enemy. You see, that's language Judah would understand. There was battle that they were thinking about. They were concerned about these things. They had to be very careful in their actions for fear of what Assyria would do to them. Note the words of the author of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And that's the message being portrayed here. Assyria is not going to succeed forever. Are they in power now? Yes, they are. Are they a threat now? Yes, they are. But don't go to Egypt for help. Come to me for help. We're going to see that as we continue to move along into the next chapter. That is what God wanted all along. He wanted to help them. He wanted to care for them. He wanted to protect them, to fight their battles, and they were not willing. To do so, they would have needed to remain in a proper relationship with him. You see, it was a conditional covenant that God made with Joshua as they came into the land. And here Judah was ruining it. Not only were these alliances going on, but they were falling prey to the same problem as the 10 northern tribes of idolatry. And they were going to suffer the consequences of that in captivity. That's somewhat interesting as I see this. I haven't thought about this, and I might want to develop it further here later. The removal of Assyria, as God promised, was also going to bring about the captivity of Judah, as God promised. It's going to be seen as a blessing in one sense, because Assyria is going to be taken away. But it's also going to bring about the national demise of Judah because of their rejection, because of their rebellion against God. When you look at verse 29, there are references there, languages used speaking of festivals. They were a time of rejoicing, music and dancing and feasting, joy, laughter, smiles on faces. All of these things were seen in these scenes of the festivals. The temple that was on Mount Zion was a symbol of the presence of God. Remember the mercy seat and what impact that had to them. They had been told earlier back in Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 4 that God was an everlasting rock. He wasn't going anywhere. He was stable. He was secure. He was a foundation for their life if they had only heeded what he had to say. There in verse 30, we find again some more anthropomorphic language that is being used. We see the figure of the arm of the Lord. And that was frequently used by Isaiah to refer to God's actions against evildoers, his judgment. We'll see that even more in 3 more chapters, chapter 40 and verse 10, chapter 51 and verse 9, chapter 52 and verse 10. But not only is it judgment against evildoers, but it's also protection of God's people. We'll also see that symbol being used again in chapter 40, chapter 59, chapter 62, chapter 63, as we start to see the book of Isaiah wrap up. So we see God's judgment is depicted in one sense, metaphorically, by his arm, but also we see delivery and protection being seen by his arm. Well, in verses 31 to 33, as we wind up this chapter, the king of Assyria is referenced there, and he was shown as representing a nation of bloodthirsty people that are going to be destroyed. You can read about it a little bit, although not in a very deep manner in Scripture, how horrible that Assyria was. But if we look to the historians that write of this, what's been found archaeologically in documents and in pictures and things such as that, Assyria was a bloodthirsty people. A picture has been drawn of a rope with a bunch of smaller ropes hanging off of it with a fishing hook on the end of those smaller ropes. And they would be put through the lips of people, and they would be tied together in that sense and carried away. They were horrible. They were cruel in their dealings with others. But here Isaiah, again, metaphorically, he uses a symbolic term. He says Tophet was ready to receive him. Now, Tophet was the site in the valley of Hinnom that was just south of Jerusalem. Solomon had sinned there by erecting Molech. 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 7 bears that out for us. Other kings had followed Solomon's example by offering their sons and daughters to Molech there in the valley of Hinnom. Jeremiah 32:35, one passage among many. Josiah had basically turned that area into a dump ground, as had Hezekiah, gathering all of these things to do with idolatry and burning them there in the Hinnom Valley. It said there, in depicting that the fire never went out there. It was always burning. What better way to describe hell and eternal fire than using language such as this? Gehenna is language that comes from that. The word Gehenna, as a matter of fact, is the word that we use for hell, the eternal dwelling place of the dead, place of fire and brimstone. That word, Gehenna, is derived from a Hebrew name meaning Valley of Hinnom. So here we see language being used to talk about a place that fire burned forever. It was a dump ground. Things were basically dumped there and destroyed and burned. That language is used in Matthew 5:22, also verses 29 and 30, Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, James chapter 3, and verse 67. What's going to happen to Assyria? They're going down. They're going to be destroyed, and it's going to be God who does it. Well, now let's shift gears and see how far we can get in chapter 31. We're moving into the next woe now. And as I said in the introductory remarks, we're looking at woe to worldly trust. So let's read verses 1 through 3 and look at woe against a faithless trust. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel nor seek the Lord. Yet he also is wise and will bring disaster, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of evildoers and against the help of those who work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who is helped will fall down. They all will perish together. We've talked in past lessons about the folly of looking to Egypt for help, and this is being depicted and emphasized a little bit more here in this section. But we also see a double warning here. It's not just going to be Egypt who is going to go down. Egypt was godless. Egypt was faithless. They had their own pagan worship and rituals. And those are the ones that Judah was looking to deliver them. But not only would Egypt go down, Judah is also going to go down because they failed to put their trust in God. Motyer, in his commentary on Isaiah, focused on this word go down. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help. And the idea there is he refers to that in the Hebrew language being a participle that denotes the state of affairs. The word rely is an imperfect word denoting characteristic behavior. And trust, look, and seek are all perfects, denoting settled attitudes. Now, Shackelford also brings that up in his commentary. So let's see what all of that means now, having looked at the grammar. An act or an action reveals one's character, and it expresses decision that you've made. Judah had a character of weakness. They looked to others for strength. Putting God aside at this point now, we're looking at what happened with them in Egypt. They went down to Egypt. In other words, it signified there was something that they were lacking, something that they were needing. They made a decision and they put it into action in seeking alliance with Egypt to answer their problems. This misplaced trust was going to bring disaster. They thought that was the answer. That's the solution they came to. And again, we could talk all about the trouble that man has gotten himself into over and over again as he seeks to find his own solution to what he sees as a problem, ignoring the obvious, God's promises to help. But you see, God's promises to help, remember, came at a price. They wanted their idols. They had those idols that they carved out of the trees and out of the rocks. But those idols were not going to deliver them. They looked to Egypt. Egypt was not going to deliver them. Only God could do so. God was more than capable of taking Assyria down. He was more than capable of protecting and providing for his people, but they were having none of it. They sought their own solution in attempting that alliance with Egypt. Same song, next verse here again. It's already been spoken of in these books of woe. They've already been told. They've been told before what was going to be. Go all the way back to Ahaz. Ahaz learned in chapter 7 that alliances with men were not the answer. Seek God, because it's God that's going to bring the promises back about. These kings were placing their trust in help from Egypt and not from God. Somebody may say, well, they just sought out Egypt. Yes, but to seek out Egypt, they had to reject God. To cling to Egypt, they had to rebel against God, with whom they had entered a covenant of following his will as related in Mosaic law. All of that was a part of their past. And now we're looking at consequences of centuries of not doing what God determined. Remember, things were pretty solid through the first three kings of the United Kingdom, Saul, David, Solomon. But after Solomon, the kingdom divided. You got the 10 northern tribes, the temples built at Dan and Bethel, and you see them being carried away into Assyrian captivity about 722. Judah is going to follow suit. The same problem, even though numerous prophets had been sent, they were still looking to their gods for their trust and not the God of heaven. And seeking an alliance with Egypt was just another manifestation of the rebellion and rejection that had already been manifested regarding Judah and God. And now it's time, as the saying goes, to pay the piper. Now it's time for God to settle the matter. And here he's speaking of that settlement, that judgment. God's judgment is certain. In other words, he's not going to take it back. Once he expresses it, once he sets those wheels in motion, he's not going to be deterred. He's not going to change. There's only going to be one thing that's going to turn Judah around. There's only going to be one thing that would help Judah avoid what was coming, and that was repentance. So many prophets were sent to them for that. Let's move this forward over 150 years from this point. Isaiah prophesied about 740, 720 BC. Jeremiah prophesied just before the Babylonian invasion, which I believe was what's being spoken of here. 606 BC, over 100 years, they had time. Prophets again were sent, and they continued to reject every one of them. They did not repent, as was stated. God's judgment is certain because his word proclaiming it would never be retracted. God does not change his mind once his mind is set. Now, that was an imposing thing here because it referred to judgment. But let's take that to a positive in our eternal future. God's not going to change his mind. God has offered his terms of pardon. And as long as we're faithful, God's going to follow through. He can't lie. He cannot change his way. That's his character. That's his nature. We can take great comfort in it. There's no comfort in this message here. You're going down, is what he said. And nobody can stop it. His actions are sure. Verse 3, trusting in Egypt is declared to be foolish as compared to trusting in God. These Egyptians were mere men. They weren't gods. Now, many of those pharaohs like to see themselves as a god, and the people often put them up on pedestals as their gods. But remember, they also placed great stock in their army, in their horses and their chariots. They were indeed powerful as it relates to that, but they're not powerful as it relates to God. It's just flesh. It's human flesh. It's animal flesh. There's nothing special about Egypt in what they could do and what they could stop. God demands to be held sovereign. God is creator. God is the one who is in control. His will is that which men are to follow. But only God. That's what sovereign is. You see, he's sovereign even when compared to Egypt. He's sovereign even when compared to Assyria. Only he is going to continue. Only he is going to live on. And his will is what will make the determination always, not what men have to say. The decisions of these rulers of Judah in seeking Egypt would indeed result in disaster for Judah. Let's look at verses 4 and 5 and see. We should have time to cover those two verses. For thus the Lord has spoken to me, as a lion roars and a young lion over his prey. When a multitude of shepherds is summoned against him, he will not be afraid of their voice, nor be disturbed by their noise. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight for Mount Zion and for its hill. Like birds flying about, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending, he will also deliver it. Passing over, he will preserve it. Okay, remember these things were being done because of a fear of Assyria. And the promise is God's going to take care of Assyria. Again, verses 4 and 5 carries that simple statement, trust in the Lord. The only way that they could reverse the course that they had charted for themselves was to put their trust only in God. So therefore, they're going to have a complete change of mind that's going to result in a change of action and approach. Don't go to Egypt. Egypt's going to fall. That's just flesh and blood, animal, human. They're not going to stand. God's going to punish them too. They're not going to be able to do what God can do against Assyria. Only God can provide what they need. God desires to do so. Here's the point that is so ironic. They wanted nothing to do with God, and all God wanted was what was best for them and their faithful compliance to Him and to His will. For man to acknowledge God's sovereignty is what He wants, but He also wants to bless those who are in that covenant relationship with Him. That had been said over and over again. Go back to the promise to Abraham. Through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That's what God wanted to do. When the people were taken to Goshen, Goshen was not the land that God wanted them to have. That wasn't the promised land. That wasn't the land flowing with milk and honey. It was indeed a place, but it wasn't what God desired. So they were delivered from Egyptian bondage. And they took that long, difficult trek to the promised land. And under the leadership of Joshua and Caleb, they went in and they started taking the land. Remember when the spies were sent into the land, they came back with evidence and a cluster of grapes and said, yes, the land is everything God said it would be, but that's where man got in the way. If they had just stopped with, yes, the land is everything God said it would be, and then moved ahead faithfully, it would have been an entirely different story. Yet we know their lack of faith resulted in an entire generation dying as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Initially, when they went in and took the land, it was everything God said it would be, and God wanted to bless them and to care for them, and He did. They benefited. The land was divided, and for a time, things were good. But then the further and further they went, the further and further from God they grew, and then sought man-made solutions to their problems. And that's what was continuing right here in the day that Isaiah is addressing in our text. Isaiah used two similes in making or presenting this message. First of all, the lion, and then also flying birds. But what he was doing there was using language they could understand to describe the protection that would come from God. Don't be afraid. He will deliver it. He will deliver them there. In the same way, God would protect His people from the Assyrians. Now, we're going to see in the next couple of chapters how that takes place, and we're going to go toward a story that we all know well, and we'll discuss it, and it's going to be what occurred with two individuals being focused on, Sennacherib of Assyria and Hezekiah of Judah. Sennacherib was coming, 185,000 men strong, and he his own self said, I had him, Hezekiah, shut up as a bird in a cage. And we know what happened. We had a picture, a display of the power of God as it related to His protection from Assyria. We'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week. Until then, until next time, God bless you.